So we're talking about our 3-year research project, which is funded by the Leverhulme Trust, which is called People, Products, Pests and Pets, a bit of a tongue twister, and it's about how animals are represented in language. And I'm just going to say a little bit about the overall shape of the project first, and then we'll tell you about some of the early data analysis. We've not been doing this for very long. It started in October last year. So one of the things we're doing is recording interviews with people whose work involves producing language about animals, and we're also inviting people to participate in focus groups to respond to language about animals, and we'll say a bit more about that towards the end. We're looking at things like the way that legislation about animals is framed and the language that is used to do that, and the way that people who have a concern about animals in various respects represent them in their campaign literature. So that's another aspect of the kind of data that we're collecting. We're hoping to look at social media where people are talking about animals, so discussion forums, blogs, online media and things like that. And also, animals often feature in the news, so we're looking at newspaper reports about animals as well. We have some wildlife documentaries transcribed where people are communicating with the public at large about animal behaviour in TV broadcasts and so on. And we also have some data that is collected from food labels. Chris put these pictures together and he tells me that canned kookaburra is a joke. It's actually a soft toy that you have inside there, not an actual something to eat. But of course these things like what categories we put animals in, you know, which ones do we eat if we do, and obviously some people don't and are very opposed to eating animal flesh in any form. Which ones do we regard as pests and so on. That's why the title of the project is what it is, these different categories that animals can be placed in. I keep pressing the wrong button because I'm not used to Prezi. So what we're trying to find out, how do people talk and write about animals? What sorts of different kinds of language are used when they talk about different kinds of animals? And do different people talk about animals in different sorts of ways? So those are the sort of overarching research questions that the project is concerned with. The reason why we're interested in this is that language is never transparent. We often focus on the content of the message and overlook the language in which that message is expressed. And there is quite a lot of research evidence that suggests that our ways of thinking about things in the world, all sorts of things, but we're interested in these particular things, that our ways of thinking are influenced by the ways language is structured and the choices we make about language. So once you've labelled an animal as a pest, what follows from that? Which kinds of animals can be called pets and which ones just cannot be thought of as being a pet? When do we personalise animals by referring to them as he or she, and when do we use a more neutral pronoun or a less personalised sort of pronoun? And there is this area of sensitivity around animals that can or can't be eaten, and different people have different views about that. But we developed in the language ways of talking about animals when they are to be eaten, which are different from the names of the animals themselves, and so on. So these are the sorts of things we're looking at and collecting linguistic data in order to answer. We're also looking at the way scientists talk about animals, and academic researchers who are working in some way or another with living creatures write up the work that they do and what they found out, and how do they do that? What language do they use to do that? And it's that particular subset of all the data that we're collecting that we're going to be talking about today. Just to give you a bit more background on the project as a whole, it's a collaborative project, so Chris and I both work at the University of Birmingham, but the principal investigator is Professor Guy Cook at King's College in London, and there's a counterpart researcher to Chris who's working in London with him. And we have 2 PhD students. Our language data is mostly about contemporary British English, but we've got a PhD student in London looking at contrast between Romanian and British English discourse, and Emma McLaughlin, who's here today, is looking at changes in the way that languages animals are represented in language over time. So although we're mainly looking at contemporary British English, we're sort of spreading outwards to other languages and other time periods as well. We've also got some excuse me, some consultants who are working with us. Nikki Clayton, who's involved in animal cognition, Nikki Charles, who's involved in sociology and the way that people incorporate animals into their families as pets, and Mara Mealy, who looks at ethical relations between animals and human society. And then we've got a steering group of people at both universities who have expertise in different areas. I won't go through all the details of that, but just to sort of give you a sense of how the project is organised. So the questions for today are up here, and Chris will talk you through them.
Okay, hello. So the questions for today: how do scientists write about life and death in relation to animals in scientific journals? And before I get into that, I'll just talk a bit about the data set that we have and how we're actually looking at that data set. So we're going to apply a corpus linguistics methodology. Some of you know what that is, but for those of you who don't, essentially what we're doing is looking at computerized texts and using software to analyze linguistic features. And the data that we have is 1,600 journal articles from 30 journals that have been published from Elsevier. We'll be looking at three basic tools: collocates, clusters, and concordances. So I'll just briefly go over those. Now, a collocate is essentially a word that co-occurs with another word. So an example of that might be engine and fire. Fire engine collocate quite frequently in English, whereas another random set of words, fire and mobile, do not. So we're interested in those collocates that occur quite frequently. And likewise, with the introduction of the Kindle Fire, a new collocate enters into the English language. So those are the kinds of things that we'll be looking at when we focus on collocates. And to do so, we can make use of one of the software tools, clusters. And essentially what this does is it searches for all the words that collocate with a particular search term. In this case, life. Now, this is just an example of the cluster that we've pulled up from this. As you can see, the most frequent collocate for life in academic scientific journals is life cycle. And there are a couple of other instances, one with a hyphenated example there. Okay. So we take this further by looking at the concordances, the lines in which life cycle might occur. So what we do then is choose a node word, in this case, life cycle. And the software, once we run a search for this, will find every occurrence of this term and display that in a line. And it will display the words to the left and to the right of that as well. And we're able to then sort the various lines in a number of ways. So this is an example of a concordance line. The line of blue in the middle there is the node word, life cycle. And the line of green is one of the ways I've sorted this data. So I've sorted them alphabetically by the second word to the left of life cycle. Now I'll go into this in a little more detail now and pick out some samples. Now there are 143 instances of life cycle, so I won't go through all of them. I'll just pick out some of the features that are particularly interesting. Okay. So as you can see here, I've picked out a couple of the lines that actually feature certain animals. In this case, highlighted in blue, parasites, viruses, and some microbial creatures. Now this brings us up to the first question we'd had to answer in our project. What is an animal? And it's a little more complex than it at first appears. Now, for the project, we've decided to focus on those animals that we can see with the naked eye for a number of reasons, one of them practical. There are quite a large number of microorganisms, or as you can see, they're arthropods, which include insects, arachnids, crustaceans. Essentially, all the animals in the world that have been identified present a practically infinite amount of examples or case studies to investigate. So we've narrowed down our focus for the project as a whole on those animals we can see with the naked eye. Nevertheless, as you can see, there's a a line there that's underlined in red. Many mammals can serve as reservoirs. And that's something that's interesting to flag up as it speaks about something to the relationship between mammals and parasites, and about this notion of pests, and how mammals are metaphorized as this body that contains various life forms. In this case, bats are the ones that are singled out. Okay. The next slide. Now, this is another series of lines that reflect a different set of animals that are described in terms of life cycles. As you can see highlighted in blue, there are a couple of animals. Fleas, which occur quite a lot in this data. D. bacarum is that insect you see in the top right corner. And we've also got some marine creatures, sharks, Atlantic salmon, and T. calipeda is actually a parasite that does grow to a size that's quite visible. As you can see underlined in red, these phrases here, a partially bivoltine life cycle or an average life cycle, are different ways in which life cycles of these creatures are characterized. And underlined in blue, in interrupt, maintaining, those are different interventions that can occur in relation to the life cycle. So a life cycle can be interrupted or maintained. And as you notice underlined in black, there's this notion of the shark's life cycle making them vulnerable in a particular way. So there is an associated issue of risk involved with the creature's life cycle. And likewise, highlighted in black right at the bottom, the last line, there's talk of modeling population dynamics of the life cycle of the salmon. And in our project, we're looking at actual creatures, not virtual creatures. But this does flag up an interesting relationship between an actual salmon and the way in which scientists might simulate that life in order to control it better. And I'll speak a bit more about control shortly. Okay, next slide. Sorry about that. Okay, so segmentation. I've chosen these lines because they speak to some of the ways in which life cycles are analyzed by scientists. Now, as you can see, there's a couple of different ways in which I've underlined this. I've highlighted in blue those creatures that are once again associated with life cycles. So here we've got organisms, any species, dogs and cats. We've also got an instance of animal waste there being associated with the life cycle. So this flags up the point that animals and inanimate objects are also analogously considered in terms of a life cycle. So that highlights another route for investigation for the project. Now, in green there, I've highlighted a couple of terms, during and complete, that speak to this notion of persistence over time with regards to a life cycle, and the ways in which those categories are actually split up into different modules, stages or phases, and these are quite frequently occurring collocates of life cycle, stage during the life cycle or phase during the life cycle. So once again, there's this anatomization of a model of life. And they're also characterized in terms of complexity, in terms of simplicity and complexity. And this may be one of the reasons why one of the most frequently occurring creatures to be talked of in terms of a life cycle are viruses, microorganisms, and the like. Because of their relative simplicity, it offers scientists a set of creatures that are relatively easy to investigate in a short amount of time. The last line there, which talks about life cycles being extremely hard to analyze, or its consequences being too complicated, once again speak to this anxiety about control with regard to experimentation on animals or investigations of life cycles. So it's this notion of this idea of control that I'm quite interested in pursuing in regard to life and death. So what I've done is explored the different ways in which control might be factored into this consideration. What I've done is run a couple of clusters again and some concordance lines. Now, with regard to concordances, I found 7,644 instances of control. So of course I've had to narrow that down for the purposes of this talk, and I've done that by focusing on the colloquet control over, in which case we have 43 instances of this, which I've split into 6 different groups. As you can see there, I'll just go through these groups for you. The first group, animals as control over their environment. Now I've highlighted in blue factors relating to this. So we've got an explicit discussion of the environment in blue, but we've also got this notion right at the bottom of escape from or control over stresses in the environment. So in this case, scientists are interested in looking in particular at the ways in which animals interact with their environments, the stresses that might impact their behavioral or physiological activity. And on the third line from the bottom, this one here, we've got discussion of a male's loss of control over his group. And this is environmental because it relates to this notion of an enclosure and the ways in which animals behave in that closed enclosure, and the ways enclosing animals allow scientists to control them in different ways. Speaking of control in different ways, I've underlined in red a couple of different ways in which animals, intervene in their environment. So we've got this notion of a demonstration in word show, a loss of a male's control, and also this notion of preventing an animal's escape from. Now this is a scientist's intervention into an animal's control over their environment. And there's also this notion of expressing control over, which is quite an interesting verb to use in relation to control. It brings in this notion of communication. Okay. In the next group, we've got animals' control over their physiology and behavior. So there aren't very many examples of this, actually. There are only 6 in total. But the actual creatures that have control in this case are crocodiles, large snakes, and B. woodhousei, which I must admit I've actually forgotten after having looked that up. Now, this is interesting because this represents quite a different order of animal from the ones that we've already looked at. Crocodiles and large snakes seem to be investigated in terms of properties of their physiology, blood flow, and the rate of heat exchange. They're interesting to scientists, though, because of the ways in which they are able to control that. So, underlined in red, crocodiles may have some control over. There's this uncertainty expressed with regard to what we know about their physiology and behavior. Large snakes have extensive behavioral control. And this is interesting because a lot of journals, such as Biomaterials, explicitly investigate creatures such as this because they're interested in their applications for engineering principles. So this speaks of another relationship to animals in the scientific literature. B. woodhousei, exert control over TB in the field. And this verb exert speaks again back to that verb in the last slide that I highlighted, express. They're related, they're roughly synonyms in this context, but they do speak to a way of viewing animals that I'll discuss in the next slide. So, in the third group, we've got researchers' measurement and control over various different parameters. And this group represents, there are quite a lot of lines here, and highlighted in blue, we've got quite a frequent colloquet that occurs in relation to control over, a degree of or a level of control. Once again, we get an instance of anatomization of a life cycle in terms of control. So control is actually split up into degrees, like degrees of protractor that can be measured. But unlike, say, a protractor, these aren't discrete degrees that we can actually measure in a systematic way. So what's important here is that a greater degree of control or an improved control or maintaining control are what's desired by scientists in this case. So once again, an anxiety about control. And highlighted in red are a couple of instances of the things that scientists attempt to gain control over. As you can see in the third line here, one of the things that scientists look at is gene expression. And as I pulled out in the last 2 slides, expression of control and exerting control are related to this notion of gene expression as well. Now, what this does is it, as I said, points out routes through a territory that we can analyze. So this does highlight some interesting avenues for further analysis with regard to control. The next group, researchers behavioral, physiological, or environmental control of animals. Once again, we've got a variety of behavioral and environmental interventions. In the third line, while such environmental control over gestation length speaks to this issue of controlling an environment and its impact on the physiology of an animal. So in this case, they're talking about ways in which farm animals such as pigs, their environment is altered and the impact that has on their gestation lengths. So there is this awareness of a direct impact of these three different factors: behavior, physiology, and the environment. Now, the last line, and Alison will speak in more detail about the issue of death, but the last line there speaks to this issue of death in scientific journals. If the investigator has control over the method of euthanasia. Now, the concordance line doesn't present the rest of that, and we can use the software to recover the context with which that line appears in. But it does point out another interesting relationship between control, life, and death. Okay. Group 5, the researchers' evaluation of the quality of control. And these lines, there are quite a lot more, there's a lot more variety in the concordance lines here. There's a variety of different evaluations: adequate control, achieve better control, complete control, discretionary, inhibitory, or disinhibitory control. Once again, words such as precise, stringent speak to this desire for a greater degree of control, this anxiety of control that I've mentioned. And right at the bottom there, highlighted in red, is another instance of an evaluative method, shall I say, sorry. This establishing a framework that allows us to assess the impact of, in this case, shellfishing on the environments and on organisms. Okay, this is the last group, and this represents that category of, in which there is no control over a variety of parameters. In this case, underlined in blue, a situation, an event, or cold temperatures. Highlighted in red are the different players who have no control. So people, dogs, mice, and right at the bottom there, there's price takers, and this flags up another way in which scientists interact with animals at the analytical level. They're envisioned as price takers in this economic system almost, in which energy is viewed as price paid in order to capture prey. So this is another way in which animals, the relationship between different animals, predator and prey, are envisaged, as well as the relationship between scientists and animals. Okay, so just to summarize the two major points, I've really only looked at two clusters, this cluster life cycle and control over. Life, it's viewed as a cycle, and this notion of a cycle does combine life and death into a single concept. And it also implies this notion of future generations, because it is a cycle that implicitly it doesn't end. So that's another avenue that we can investigate for scientists' relationship to the animals they use. And once again, there's this focus on segmentation, anatomization, measurement, which demonstrates quite clearly this anxiety over control. Okay, so what of death? Let me turn to Alison Seeley, who will talk in a bit more detail about that.
I want you to stay there though and do that
Sure.
thing with the advancing the slide, because I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do it. So before we move into this, what Chris has been doing here is illustrating how we look at this kind of linguistic data. Most of the people who would write for these journals or read these journals obviously are making linguistic decisions, but their main emphasis is to explain what they found to other scientists in their field. And we're coming in with a very different sort of perspective to say, what language choices are people making and what patterns do we find there? But before I go on to the more grisly part about killing animals, which is a theme within these journal articles necessarily, does anyone have any questions at this point, or any sort of points of clarification that you'd like us to explain about what we're doing, or why we're interested in this sort of thing, or how it fits with your own interests? Because we don't necessarily know what you are interested in or know already. Any questions or points that anyone wants to bring up? Yeah.
So I understand how you chose life cycle, but why did you start out with life? What other words?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Life and death.
Yeah, the theme of the week, the Festival of Arts and Science, is life and death. And so we thought, well, from all the different ways that we're looking at our data and collecting data, how might we produce something that would be of interest to that theme? So we thought we'd look at life and death as starting points, and then obviously once Chris starts to do the analysis on the word life, it leads into this life cycle, and then there's this issue of the human interaction with the creatures and their lives as a cycle, and the sort of control and measurement theme sort of just leaps out in a sense, doesn't it? Any other? Yeah.
I was just wondering about the control over element, and given your corpus, control over is likely to be assumed by many of the authors as taken for granted as
yes.
normally correct and so on.
Yes.
So I wondered if there's a way that you can capture a wider sense of control over that might not actually be written down as control over.
That's a really interesting question, yes. Yes. I mean, with any sort of linguistic analysis, there is the issue of what is actually said and then how we interpret what is said. And I think you're quite right that in these examples we've got the advantage of that idea being made quite explicit, but there are lots of more subtle ways that people indicate their stance towards different aspects of life and different creatures and so on. And what we sometimes find, and there isn't time to go into it today, but what you sometimes find is that it's actually the little, apparently less meaningful words that carry some of those assumptions and evaluations. And I think we can get at those through corpus methods, but it's a bit more complicated and a bit less sort of obvious how you go into that. But I think that's a really interesting point and something that we want to continue to pursue, because I think this domain of working with animals in order to understand them better, and also in order to understand other issues better, does, as you say, take for granted that by the time you've gone through all your ethical reviews in order to be allowed to conduct these laboratory experiments or whatever it is, certain assumptions about your relationship to animals are kind of given, and a sort of part of what we might call a discourse community. And that's why it's interesting to look at these and then perhaps compare this sort of data with other ways that people talk about these issues. Certainly people who are very opposed to the use of animals in scientific experiments and so on, which obviously, as we've said, is quite a emotive issue. Can you advance the slide for me, Chris? So I looked at the words killed and killing, given that we were talking about life and death, and that the death of animals in these contexts is often brought about deliberately. And this is just to show you an example of a concordance of the word killed, again to sort of show you how we can look at the data. The reason my red lines and green lines are further apart than the ones that Chris was showing you is that I was actually looking for the clusters within a span to give us an indication. It's not an absolutely infallible indication, but if you say, well, tell me which words occur 5 to the left, 5 to the right of the word killed, we'll get an idea of what's doing the killing and what's being killed. So I then looked at the words that occur in that span. And the sorts of things that occur near the word killed in this data set that we've described, some words that name a specific sort of animal, so chickens, salmon, snail, for example, some that refer to the creatures in a general sort of way, and obviously, you know, with a particular orientation towards them. So if you're looking at a specimen, that's already an idea about what stance you as a researcher take towards a creature that you're working with. Sometimes what the scientists are interested in, and I should say, of course, these journal articles aren't all about laboratory work, some of them are about work in the field with different sorts of animals. And in veterinary practice and so on, but the ways in which creatures are related to each other when it's relevant to mention which sex they are and so on. Sometimes a word near killed is a word for a part of an animal, a word like wings or kidney, or a generic word like tissue. And yet again, of course, a lot of what gets talked about or written about are tiny creatures we can't see, or tiny organisms we can't see, and we've had to struggle with a sort of philosophical problem of how small do you go before you stop considering it an animal, which is again a sort of linguistic as well as a metaphysical question. And then there are words like controls and groups that occur near the word killed. So if I quantify those, you get a rough idea that the smallest things are the biggest group. So it's microorganisms, words denoting microorganisms which occur most frequently near killed. Then words for specific animals, then words for a part of an animal, then those collective terms, generic terms, and then some other or ambiguous ones that were difficult to classify. So out of all the things that occur near the word killed in this particular corpus, it's microorganisms or specific animals that form the majority of those words. That doesn't tell us obviously what's killing what, but it gives you an indication of what is occurring near to the word killed in the corpus. So what are animals killed by? It's a kind of truism in the analysis of scientific discourse that scientists use the passive voice. That's the construction where you say something is done by something else rather than somebody does something. And it's very often in this kind of construction that the word killed appears. So all animals were killed, 2 animals in each group were killed. It isn't made explicit who is doing the killing. It's much more a question of this was the effect that was brought about, but we don't say who brought it about. But you can infer from these examples that it was the researchers who did it. So for welfare reasons, animals were killed if bad things were happening to them. Controls and test animals were killed with formalin. It's fairly obvious that that happened because someone involved in the experiment or the research did the killing. But sometimes animals were said to have been killed in other circumstances, and as I say, some of our data is not about laboratory work. So scientists are interested in how animals are being killed by vehicles, how animals that are taken into shelters are killed. I mean, there are other words for this. I was wanting to sort of euphemize there and talk about, euthanasia or destroyed or something. But we're only looking at the precise word killed in this example. But quite a sort of emotive and expressive stance here, an appalling rate of attrition, animals being killed. So this presumably is not talking about what researchers are doing themselves, but about what other people do. So that's the sort of, mostly occurs in the passive voice. Animals were killed, and we have to guess who did it, or it was other people who did it. When it goes into the active voice and look at kill as a verb, I took out some occurrences where it's not a verb, like road kill and so on. Kill is less frequent than killed. We get less representation of somebody actively doing killing in this data than we do of things being killed. So 351 occurrences. 87 uses where you can tell from the context who's doing the killing, where something is clearly killing something else. And I didn't find any examples of researchers actively killing, even though you get it indirectly in the other data. It's much more other sorts of agents that are responsible. So as we've said all along, a lot of this data is about tiny things that are not necessarily visible to the naked eye. So you get one kind of tiny creature or entity killing another one. That's quite a common finding. Some of these words I've had to look up, and like Chris, I can't necessarily remember what they mean. Some of you here may know what these words mean, but these are tiny things that are responsible for killing often other tiny things. So that does get... Sorry, is someone going to say... I thought someone was going to put me right on what these words mean. Sorry, Chris. So that's a very common pattern that we're talking about, a bacteria killing an enzyme or the other way around or so. And when it's other people who are doing killing, they can be named. So anglers, this is an interesting construction, need to kill fish that have been badly injured. The idea of how this comes about we can look at through these extra verbs like need, must, should, might, those sorts of constructions can be quite interesting. Again, anglers killing fish, hunters killing tigers, hunting effort killing an entire population. Those sorts of constructions tell us about research that has identified animals being killed by other people. Again, large things can be killed by tiny things or by processes. Things like temperature are often the agents of killing. So temperature is high enough to kill the fruit flies. Winter frosts can kill individuals. So what you get from this data en masse is this sense of life being terminated by all sorts of agents and processes and events, not necessarily by somebody deliberately taking the decision to end the life of a living creature. And of course, animals will go and kill each other as well. So you have instances like males will kill pups, some other sort of creature will kill the pup of the female, the mother, cats killing animals and birds, mothers of larger litters killing their offspring, broody hens killing chicks, tigers killing sheep. So I think that this sort of set of examples gives you that sense of that world of nature red in tooth and claw, where whatever we might do or whatever we might think is the right thing to do or might be done in a sacrificial way for bigger ends in the future or whatever, that there's lots of evidence in our data of creatures killing each other, whatever we might think about that. So I think we've sort of tried to give you a flavour of the sorts of things we're interested in, a very small part of it, and the sorts of questions we're asking, the kinds of things we can find out from our data using the techniques that we're using. I hope it's made a little bit of sense for communicating a bit about the project, and I think Chris is going to sort of round off now, and then we can talk about it if you have any questions or points you'd like to make.
Okay. So that was some of the preliminary data that we had for our projects, and now we're looking forward to the project as a whole. So we are running some focus groups, as we mentioned at the beginning. So if anyone would like to get involved in a focus group, or if you know people who work with animals in some capacity and may be interested in volunteering for that, I've got some flyers here, and I can pass that around or chat to you about the focus groups. And we've also got a cluster of social media that's ready to go live. So we've got a website that's shortly going to be launched, along with a Twitter and Facebook feed that's here as well. Now, on the website, there's a couple of ways that you can get involved in the project, one of which is a kind of query page where you can submit queries that we could then take on board for analysis. So, as I said, that website will go live shortly, and I've got some more information about the social media here. But aside from that, if anyone's got any questions about the project as a whole, or about anything related to this talk in particular, we'd be happy to take them now.